Welcome to the sixth video in this module. In this video, we will provide some of the historical context behind DBT by reviewing the three waves of behaviorism and comparing traditional CBT with DBT. There have been three waves of behaviorism. The first wave was behavioral therapy, an exclusive focus on behaviors. And we can go to our two pioneers of Pavlov and Skinner to understand where behaviorism came from. Pavlov noticed that he could condition dogs' behaviors through associations and came up with this whole scheme of conditioned and unconditioned stimulus versus conditioned and unconditioned responses. Pavlov noticed that the presence of food automatically elicits salivation in dogs. That's an example of an unconditioned stimulus, the food automatically eliciting an unconditional response. Then Pavlov noticed that if a bell was repeatedly paired with food, eventually the bell would elicit salivation in dogs by itself. That's an example of a conditioned stimulus, the bell, eliciting a conditioned response through association. Dogs and humans can learn a lot simply by association. Then came B.F. Skinner and realized that we also learn from consequences. Skinner noticed he could reinforce pigeons' behaviors through consequences. He also came up with this four-part scheme of positive and negative reinforcement, as well as positive and negative punishment. Positive reinforcement refers to an increase in behavior by adding a consequence. For example, if I take out the trash, my wife gives me a compliment. She is trying to increase my behavior by giving me a consequence, a compliment. Negative reinforcement refers to increasing behavior by removing a consequence. For example, if I take out the trash, my wife stops nagging. Therefore, I am even more motivated to take out the trash, increase my behavior to remove that consequence. Positive punishment refers to decreasing a behavior by adding a consequence. For example, if I am late for supper, my wife might give me extra broccoli. She is trying to decrease my behavior of being late by adding a consequence, more broccoli. Negative punishment refers to decreasing behavior by removing a consequence. For example, if I am late for supper, my wife says no dessert for you. She's trying to decrease my behavior by removing a consequence. What Skinner realized is we can influence behavior by different combinations of consequences. Behavior therapy was basically about how can we apply these insights that we learned from animals to humans. And we realized that you can also influence human behavior through associations or consequences. That brings us up to the second wave of behaviorism, cognitive behavioral therapy. CBT adds insights gained from cognitivism. Basically, we learned that we have a lot more going on in our gray matter, our prefrontal cortex, than dogs and pigeons. In contrast to animals, humans are strongly influenced by beliefs about the self, others, and the world. CBT especially focuses on how thinking errors or cognitive distortions affect our behavior, because our thought patterns are not always helpful or accurate for that matter. CBT does not discount anything we learned from first wave behaviorism. It builds on it. Now we have a focus on both thoughts and behaviors. That brings us to third wave behaviorism, which is basically CBT plus mindfulness. Third wave behaviorism continues to focus on both thoughts and behaviors and utilizes mindfulness as the main tool for acceptance and change. DBT, as one example of third wave behaviorism, uses mindfulness to teach skills to help clients become more dialectical or more balanced. Let's focus a little bit more on DBT. DBT does continue in the CBT tradition and addresses both cognitive and behavioral components. However, the way DBT deals with cognitive and behavioral processes is different than original CBT. Let's focus on the cognitive components first. CBT's way of dealing with problem thought patterns is basically by refuting, disputing, correcting, or challenging those thinking errors. Now, clearly, that approach has worked very well for many people. However, that approach also runs a risk of coming across as invalidating for someone with a chronic history of trauma. In contrast, DBT has a different way of dealing with problematic thought patterns. DBT addresses problematic thoughts through awareness, acceptance, and balance. In other words, through the skill sets of mindfulness and dialectical thinking. Instead of refuting, disputing, correcting, challenging thinking errors, we're simply going to learn to be more mindful of them and bring them more to the middle. That's what we mean by mindfulness and dialectical thinking. Now let's talk about the behavioral components. Original behaviorism in CBT addresses problem behaviors with conditioning or reinforcement through associations or consequences. Clearly, conditioning reinforcement can be very effective, and there's still many effective treatment modalities based on those principles. But conditioning and reinforcement are also passive processes because these are things that happen to clients. DBT, in contrast, primarily addresses problem behaviors through active skills training. The client is empowered to make their own changes because clients have to study, practice, learn, master, hone, and over time take ownership of these skills. There's 3 main skill sets that DBT teaches to help clients change their behaviors: distress tolerance, emotion regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness. Once again, DBT does not discount previous insights from behaviorism or from CBT. It builds on them. It expands the repertoire. Here are some more ways in which DBT diverges from CBT. Mindfulness is foundational to everything in DBT. If you think about it, how are you going to tolerate your distress if you don't even know what your distress is? Or how are you going to regulate your emotions if you don't know what your emotions are? Or how are you going to be more dialectical in your thinking if you don't even know what you're thinking? Or how are you going to be more interpersonally effective if you don't even know what's going on in yourself, much less someone else? Another way that DBT is unique is that DBT is explicitly open to spirituality. Spiritual traditions for thousands of years have been teaching mindfulness and specific coping skills, which is what DBT is all about. DBT is also open to appropriate self-disclosure in therapists. In fact, DBT encourages appropriate self-disclosure because that is one powerful way to foster genuineness and authenticity. Something else that makes DBT unique is that DBT has a strong treatment team approach. When you do DBT, you are doing this in collaboration with parents, teachers, psychiatrists, probation officers, etc. Something else that makes DBT unique is between session support, providing skills coaching to clients beyond formally scheduled sessions, having check-in points or other ways of interacting with clients and reinforcing skills work above and beyond traditionally scheduled sessions. DBT puts emotions and cognitions on equal footing. As you know, CBT has this sequence of thoughts, feelings, behaviors. So our thoughts influence our feelings, which in turn influence our behaviors. Therefore, if your thoughts get out of whack, well, then your feelings will be out of whack too, and so will your behaviors. But what just happened to the feelings? They're kind of sandwiched in between. CBT has a low view of emotions because emotions are basically the side effect of your thoughts. You think a certain way, therefore you're going to feel a certain way. And they're also the trigger to your behaviors, especially inappropriate behaviors. That's not a very high view of emotions. But CBT does have a high view of thoughts. Thoughts is what drives this whole sequence. If you change your thoughts, then you can change how you feel and change how you behave. DBT, in contrast, recognizes both thoughts and emotions as equally important. Finally, DBT emphasizes dialectical processes. DBT de-emphasizes the specific thinking errors that CBT has generated. Those thinking errors can provide us with lots of insight. But if you think about it, they're all basically a breakdown of dialectical processes. So instead of trying to figure out exactly what kind of a thinking error it is, DBT emphasizes a restoration of dialectics. There are 3 basic assumptions of trauma-focused DBT that I have borrowed from standard DBT. One assumption is people may not have caused all their problems, but they need to take ownership of them anyway. One major exception to that assumption is when we're working with children. Children clearly did not cause their problems, but children are also not capable of fully taking ownership of all their issues in life. But when you're working with an adolescent, you are in that tricky transition zone. when I'm working with adolescents, I am starting to teach them that, okay, you did not cause all these problems in your life, obviously, but I am helping them to start to take ownership of them anyway. Because regardless of whether it's fair or not, those are the cards that they have been dealt. And I want them to have a successful adulthood. And one of the indicators of healthy adulthood functioning is that we are able to take ownership of whatever cards have been dealt to us. Another assumption of trauma-focused DBT is new behaviors need to be learned in all relevant contexts. That's precisely why DBT has individual sessions, group sessions, and skills coaching. In other words, many opportunities to learn skills from many different angles and contexts. Something we've learned is that just because you've learned a behavior or a skill in one setting doesn't mean your brain automatically generalizes it to other settings. And the third assumption is all behaviors are caused by something, but changing the cause of the behavior is a lot more effective than judging the behavior itself. There are many things that influence our behavior. Our thoughts, our emotions, our choices, our physical body, whatever's going on in our brain, in our nervous system, and any other system in our body influences our behaviors. Our relationship with ourselves, with other people, with different groups of people. We all act one way around one person and a completely different way around someone else. The setting we're in also influences our behavior. How we act at work, at the park, or at church might be very different. DBT is about figuring out what's influencing our behavior and teaching skills to deal with those influences, as opposed to only targeting the behavior itself. DBT offers much more points of intervention than original CBT. From a CBT perspective alone, if we're going to change behavior, we're pretty much stuck with working on thoughts or the behavior itself. Whereas from a DBT perspective, we can focus on the different emphases that I mentioned here. Thoughts, emotions, choices, your physical body, your relationships, your setting, etc. So let me summarize with a few key points here. DBT is derived from the CBT tradition, which in turn is derived from the original behavioral tradition. Third wave behaviorism recognizes the role of mindfulness in influencing both cognition and behavior. DBT is an example of third wave behaviorism, since mindfulness is foundational in its approach to treatment. DBT has several emphases which distinguish it from traditional CBT or second wave behaviorism. DBT has a strong focus on mindfulness, is explicitly open to spirituality, encourages appropriate therapist self-disclosure, emphasizes a team approach to treatment, encourages between session support, emphasizes the importance of both emotions and cognitions, and involves a variety of dialectical processes. Trauma-focused DBT borrows the following three assumptions from standard DBT. People may not have caused all their problems, but they need to take ownership of them anyway. New behaviors need to be learned in all relevant contexts. And all behaviors are caused, but changing the causes of behavior is more effective than judging the behaviors themselves.